Good morning, everyone. Welcome to part two of our critical paratexts webinars. This is the technical side of it. Um, there's an awful lot to cover today, but most of it builds on what we've already covered in the past webinars. So if you find you need refreshers, you can go back to our YouTube page, and of course, always documentation. But this really brings together a lot of what we've been working on for the past year. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen, Songhees, and Kosapsum, or Esquimalt peoples, on whose territory the university stands, and the Lekwungen and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. I would also like to introduce myself. I think there are a few new faces in the crowd today. I'm Navarra. I'm LEMDO's project manager and lead trainer right now. I've been encoding with the project since 2021. Fun fact about me, I'm very excited about the gardening season coming up. You probably see all this light behind me. That's looking after some of my plants because I just couldn't wait to get my hands in some dirt. Um, and with that said, I do like to be doing things with my hands and moving around all of the time. And so if that's you as well, you want to be fidgeting, doodling, crafting, whatever it is you need to do during this webinar, please feel free to do so. Um, today, we've only got three big learning objectives, but that really is not necessarily reflective of all that you're going to be learning today. So the big things are you're going to know how to create structure in your critical paratexts. You're going to understand different structural elements that you should be using in different scenarios. And you're going to be able to add images to your files, including writing alternative text um, or alt text. So let's begin off with creating sections in your files. So in your Word documents, you might be familiar with having the different levels of headings so that you can divide your works into sections. In our TEI, we're going to use the div element, which divides things into divisions. This is what the element looks like. It stands for text division. And each section of your text can be contained by a div element. Each div element should have an XML ID attribute. It should also have a child head element. When you have a div and that div has both an XML ID and a head element, we can link to that div using pointers, which is really useful. So if you weren't here during our linking webinar, we've got two main linking elements. One is the ref, and you control what text shows up in the rendered website when you use a ref link. But when you use a pointer, it automatically generates from the head of your division. And so if down the road you change that head, your pointer automatically updates. Your link will always be up to date. You don't need to go in and do that work again and again. So having an XML ID and a head is really important just for the linking aspect of things, along with generating a table of contents for your file. We also have our heading element. It is the child of div. It can also be a child of table or of list, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. And again, the text that's in your head is what's programmatically generated when you link to a div using the pointer element. It's also how we get your table of contents. So on any LEMDO page, in the top left, there's a little hamburger menu with the three lines and the blue square. If you click on that, the first thing that pops up is a table of contents. And you don't get that in your critical paratext unless you have div elements with a child head. Now, we have a few different scenarios on how you're going to use these. And I'm going to kind of guide you through the three main ones. Excuse me. The first is you've got a paratext and it doesn't have multiple sections. It's just one text, one section. You don't need a div. There's no need for it because there's nothing other than the entire text or the individual paragraphs that you're going to be linking to. There's nothing to generate in a table of contents, so no need for a div. This is kind of what it will look like. You have your body element, which all of our TEI files will have, and then inside you have your paragraphs. Each paragraph is going to have an XML ID. As always, that XML ID will begin with your file name. Here, I'm giving the example EMD ABBR _ text intro, and then numbered paragraphs. And you'll go consecutively P1, P2, P3, and that gives you numbered paragraphs that you can link to. The next scenario is obviously you have multiple sections. And each section you want a heading for. So each section is going to be wrapped in a div, each of which will have a head element. And that's what this looks like. Again, this is made up text, but it's just a quick example. So we've got our body element, and then this made up text has two divisions. The first one is a bit about ghosts in the play. So we have our XML ID. As always, it begins with our file name, EMD ABBR _ gen intro, and then something that helps you remember what this div is about. Here it's about ghosts in the play, so we'll put an _ ghosts because that's quick and easy to read. We then have our child head element, ghosts in the play. If I were to link to this div using a pointer, ghosts in a play is what would show up in the link. I have my paragraphs. And again, each one is numbered with an XML ID. This one is the first one in the file, so it's P1. I've got my second div here, which also has a head, and it also has a paragraph. And the paragraph is numbered P2. We continue from the beginning of the file. We don't re-begin numbering with each div. So you can just keep going P1, P2, P3, P4, regardless if there are divs in there or not. This is probably the most common scenario, especially when you get into your bigger critical paratexts, like your general introduction. The final scenario that I'll go over is you have a critical paratext and it has an introductory section. It's just like something guiding you into this particular critical paratext. That first section doesn't need a div element. If you don't want to give it a heading, no need for that div. But each of your subsequent sections do require a div element with a child head. And that's what this one is. So we have here our body. We've got one paragraph, some introductory text to the rest of the critical paratext. Doesn't need a parent div. It doesn't need a section heading. So if you've got something, it doesn't have a section heading right at the beginning of your critical paratext, this is what you're doing. You're putting those paragraphs in. And then we've got two subsequent divs. As always, we've got those XML IDs and child headings. Again, our paragraphs are numbered going through the file. So we've got P1, P2, P3, not re-beginning with each div. Does this all make sense to people so far? Yeah, great. Okay. So then we have some extra structural elements. So your basics are going to be done with your divs and your paragraphs. But you also might want some lists and some tables. Lists, you've got three options. They can be bulleted, numbered, or plain. And here's how you make them. The first thing you do is you're going to add a list element. And it's going to come up as invalid with that red squiggly line because each list requires at least one item in it. Once you have your list, I like to do this right away, put on a rend attribute. This is where you decide, do I want this to be bulleted, numbered, or a simple list? Spec list, you don't need to worry about that. You won't be using it, but it will show up when you're making lists much of the time. But the three ones that you're going to worry about are the bulleted list, shows up as bulleted, not too shocking. A numbered list that shows up as a numbered list, or a simple list which shows up plain, no bullets, no numbers. So decide what you want, put that as your rend value. And this is going to pop up as a dropdown as soon as you put that rend attribute on your list element. So you don't need to have these memorized or anything. Although if there was one drop-down menu that was easy to memorize, it's probably this one. Then you're going to add at least one item. So here we've made a bulleted list. It's got one item. Then we can add our text. I've added 4 items here. We've got dogs, cats, birds, and fish. Each item is wrapped in an item element. So each of them is going to be its own bullet point in our list on the website. You can, if you would like, add a heading to your lists. So here, our heading is animals, and then we have each of our items. Now, a fairly common thing that we see is that your list is part of your paragraph. It's continuing on your text. When that's the case, your list goes inside of your P element. If you put it outside of your P element, let's say this P tag closed after the following is a list of common pets. If we ended that P tag there and then had a list, on our rendered website, you'd have this big white space in between the paragraph and the list that you probably don't want, because you want this to visually represent that this list is continuing on your paragraph. If it's not part of your paragraph, put it outside of it, but if it is, keep it inside of that P element, and it's going to make rendering look better, and it's going to be more truthful about the structure of your writing. Okay, tables. These aren't bulleted, numbered, or plain. That's a copy-paste error, sorry folks. These are just tables. Now we see these less frequently, but it's good to know how to deal with them anyhow in case you do want to add a table to any of your critical paratexts. Your first step is, of course, to add a table element. Fairly straightforward. And then in your table, you're going to have a list of rows. Your first row needs to have a role attribute with a value of label. This is that kind of list of labels at the top of a table, your headings. In that first row as a child, you're going to put in some cells. The number of cells that you put will determine the number of columns that you have in your table. So this here table has 2 columns, as indicated by it having 2 cells in that label row. Then you can put in your labels. Here, our first column is titled library. The second column is titled corrected. And then you'll add in your data. Each row of data requires a row element. It requires the role attribute with a value of data. Then it needs to have the same number of cells as that first row has. If you only put in 1 cell inside of this row, or inside of this row here, you're going to get a validation error. And our schematron will prompt you, hey, you have an inconsistent number of rows or inconsistent number of cells. You need to have 2 cells throughout your entire table because that's what you said in your label row. So here, our first cell corresponds with this first cell in the label. So the library is the BL, and it is corrected. And same thing here. So we've got a second row with data in it. Our first column says hunt, second column says uncorrected. You
Can I jump in, Navarra?
Yes, please.
I just wanted to clarify something. We don't actually require a row with the role equals label in our schema. In most cases, you do want a label row, but there are the odd situations where you don't. So if that's the case, you don't need to make up a label for the row.
Yeah. Yeah. Most cases, having a label really improves accessibility to your table, but not required. When you have the role equals label, you can also change how you sort. I believe we allow you to sort alphabetically when you have a label row. And again, if you want a heading for your table, you can put one in using that head element. It goes before any of your rows. Okay, now the big fun topic that everybody likes very much, adding images, um, bringing the pizzazz. So I'm going to preface this by saying we've recently changed our options for adding images. And so I will be guiding you through the two different options, or the two different scenarios that we now have. We haven't finished documentation yet, but that will be coming in the next few weeks. But regardless, your first step is always going to be choose which images you want for your edition or for your critical paratext. You've got two main options for format, JPEG files. You're going to use those for facsimiles, photos, paintings, drawings, etchings, anything like that. PNG is preferred for screenshots. That's generally what they automatically are. Any digital illustrations, graphs, tables, things like that. Or transparencies, like you have a logo with no background that is going into your critical paratext. Size, preferably we're aiming for about 1200 pixels wide. If your image is less than that, don't try to size it up. Just keep it at whatever the highest resolution available is. You're also, when you're choosing your images, going to be checking for your permissions to use the image. And you're going to be saving that information, including a link to wherever you got the copyright info from, if relevant, into a TXT file. And that just makes it so that we have all of that information right at hand, and it kind of travels with the image in our repo. The second step after you've chosen your images is, saving them to your computer and naming them. When you name your image, you should always begin with your edition's standard abbreviation, followed by an underscore, and then a name that clearly indicates what the image is. So we've got one image, it's in the HW portfolio. So it begins off with HW, that's his standard abbreviation for the Honest Tour. Then we have an underscore, and then the name of the file is chafing dish because it's an image of a chafing dish. Your permission files, those TXT files with copyright info, those should be using the same name as the image, followed by underscore permissions. So for this image, HW underscore chafing dish.png, our permissions file would be HW underscore chafing dish underscore permissions.txt. And again, that way we know what copyright information goes with which image, goes with which edition. So yes, we do store permission files. So we got a question. Do we store permissions files in the same directory? Yes, we do. And I will now talk about where they get stored. So we have two scenarios now. Scenario number one is you want to add 3 images or less to your entire edition. In that case, you're going to add images to the repo. To do that, you're going to be working in terminal or your command prompt. So in terminal, cd into your images folder. Inside of your portfolio, you probably have an app, a crit, and a main folder. You can also add an images folder if you don't have one already. You'll then, inside of that images folder, do svn add, followed by the file name, including that extension, so .png. And you can add two at once by putting just a space between the two file names. So svn add filename.png space filename underscore permissions.txt. And that queues them up to be added. Once you have queued them up to be added using SVN add, you can SVN commit as usual with your message, add images for HW, H5, whatever your edition is. So adding the images always has those two steps, the SVN add and the SVN commit. We have examples with images in our documentation that you might like to look at. I have put links at the end of this presentation. So if you have 3 images or less in your edition, this is how you're going to encode those images in your file. First, you're going to add a figure element. Then you'll have a child graphic element. And when you put in a child graphic element, it will automatically add the URL attribute because that's the bare minimum for things that you need on that graphic element. You're then going to add the value. It's always going to begin when you've got 3 images or less with the img : prefix. Then you'll put in your file name, including that file extension. So here, this image lives inside the repo. It's been added to the images folder in that HW portfolio. So we're using that img prefix. Next, you should add a MIME type attribute. The MIME type says what type of media is in this graphic element. This is an image. And what type of image is it? It's PNG. So it's image/PNG. If this was a JPEG, it would be image/JPEG. If it was an SVG, image/SVG. You're then going to find the image height and width and add those attributes. And if finding height and width of images is new to you, I'm going to show you how to do that right now, at least on a Windows. It's relatively similar on a Mac. Once you've got kind of how to find it, you should be able to do it. So I'll show you that right now. So for this image, I'm going to go to my LEMDO directory in my File Explorer. So here's my File Explorer. Here's LEMDO. Open that up. Try and make the text slightly bigger. I then know that my edition lives inside of data. So I'm going to go into data and then into texts. Sorry, this is tiny. I will again try to zoom in a bit. The image that I'm looking for is in HW, so I'll go through there. It's in images, I go into images. So it's just following that pathway, and you do the same pathway in your terminal, and you do the same pathway when you open up images in Project View. So here we have all of the images. This is more than 3. This is because this is the original way of adding images in LEMDO. So all of these live in the repo. But I'm then going to find my image. It's in here somewhere. Here it is, HW_chafing dish. Now, if I hover my mouse over it, I'm not sure if you can see, it's probably very tiny, but it does give dimensions, 1738 by 2500, just from hovering over. But if you want to see for sure what's the height, what's the width, you can right click, go down to properties and click that. And then your information is going to be in details. So here we have dimensions, 1738 by 2500. And then we have width is 1738 pixels, height 2500 pixels. That's the information that you want. And it's similar in Mac. You're also going to right click, and I think it's also called properties in there. Okay, so once you have that information, you're going to add your height and width attributes. Here we've got our width is 1738. Always include PX. If you don't include PX, you'll get a schematron error. Same deal with height. You put that in, you include PX. A common misconception is that when you put in height and width, you're controlling the height and width on the rendered page. And that's not how it works. This is just describing it. It's not prescriptive. Um, it's just the description of the height and the width. Yes, at the end, I'll pull up an image in a text so then you can see how that renders. Now, that's scenario one, and that's if you've been with LEMDO for a long time, you've already added your images. That's what you've done so far. We have a new option now because we've got a few things that have lots of images. And images do tend to be what take up the most space in our repo. And so we're kind of looking for ways, how do we save space? How do we save time when we're building the website on Jenkins? And part of the answer is, well, let's put images into an images server so that they're not in the repo. So if you have 4 images or more, this is what you will be doing. First thing is you're going to save your images and permissions in a shareable drive. You're going to follow the same naming conventions as before. You're then going to share whatever that is with LEMDO by emailing me at lemdopm@uvic.ca. Once you've done that, and we have said to you, yes, we have saved your images, you can then go in and you start off the exact same way. You're going to add a figure element and a child graphic element. Where it changes is your URL value. Now it's going to begin with edimg prefix. That's for your edition image. And that's just the name of where we're storing those. Then after that prefix, you now require your edition abbreviation followed by a slash. Because inside of our edition images folder, each of your editions is going to have its own portfolio. And so you need to tell it where inside of the edition images it lives. This one is an HW image, so it lives inside of the HW folder. Once you have that, again, it's the same as before. You're going to add your MIME type, still image/PNG for this one, and then add your height and width. Okay, is that all kind of making sense? Okay. All right. Once you have done that first part of the encoding, you have your graphic element, you can add alt text. So alt text describes the content of an image. It's used to make your images, your media more accessible to people who use screen readers. And it also, in addition to making your text more accessible to people who always use screen readers, if your image doesn't load for whatever reason, the alt text is what shows up. Now, we do have 2 different things that people sometimes get a bit confused by. We have alt text and we have image captions. Alt text is a literal description of the image. It doesn't supply anything not visible, and it doesn't typically show up visibly on the screen. We encode it using the desk element. An image caption, that's discussion of what's depicted. And it's also metadata, so it gives credit to wherever you got the image from. And we encode that using the fig desk element, which I'll talk about in a minute. The principles that LEMDO follows for writing alt text are accessibility, honesty, and clarity. So, does my image communicate key components? Is there anything significant that a viewer of an image would see that somebody using a screen reader would not get out of my alt text? Honesty, does my alt text truthfully describe what's in the image? And clarity, am I using subjective terms like describing someone as pretty or happy, or objective ones such as describing characteristics like using a wheelchair or smiling? We want to use those objective terms, smiling, using a wheelchair, not the subjective ones like pretty or happy. When it comes to our practice, these are our steps. First, we capture important elements of the image. So if something's important to the overall meaning or to the argument that you're trying to make about the image, describe it. In LEMDO, we often include the medium, although it's not always necessary. Once we've kind of got that main topic of your image described, check for your objective language. One that we often see come up is emotion. So with this image I have up right now, I would describe this as a girl smiling and doing a fist pump rather than saying that she's happy or proud or excited. If we do our job correctly, people reading our alt text will interpret the body language themselves. So rather than saying happy, we're going to say smiling and doing a fist bump. Then we'll make sure that our text is concise. This isn't the place for verbose and flowery descriptions. It's the place to be direct and brief. A fair guideline is under 125 characters. However, when we get text, we sometimes break that rule. Where possible, we encode text as text and images as images. But we're working with early modern playbooks. Sometimes you want to put a picture of an early modern playbook and the text that's in it. When that happens, you can transcribe it. When you've got that text, don't use quotation marks, just type it out. We typically begin text reads followed by a colon. So text reads, lorem ipsum, or text reads here. And when it's this early modern spelling, we just modernize quietly and say modernized text reads, a kind overflow of kindness. Now, again, naturally, these might go over 125 characters. And once you have that written, it goes inside of a desk element. So you have your graphic, and then the graphic has a child desk. You can add a resp attribute to say who wrote the alt text and put pers colon followed by your XML ID, and then put that alt text inside. So this is the quick description: a chafing dish, a deep bowl with 3 knobs around its rim, and a tall base. And hopefully that kind of brings to mind something that looks sort of like this. So that's your alt text. Once you're done with that, you're done with your graphic element, but you can still add your image caption. So you can give credit, give your extra information that you want to about your image. You do that by adding a fig desk element. So we've got figure, it has a child graphic, and then a child fig desk. And your text just goes straight in there. So a 16th century pottery, chafing dish made in London, all of that extra information, courtesy of the trustees of the British Museum. All of that information that you always want to appear right beside your image or right underneath your image, it goes in your fig desk. Are we all feeling happy about images? Okay, great. Other things to encode. This is our quick glance at what you should be wrapping in tags of some sort. The first thing is titles, and you're going to use a title element. There it is, add your title element. Once you've done that, you're going to choose the correct level value. So TEI and the LEMDO has 5 levels that a title can be. We have analytic, that's our A value, and that's for things like articles, poems, works published as part of a larger item. And how that renders is in quotation marks. Everything else for titles renders italicized, but our A level is quotation marks. Then we have journals, those are J. Those are for your academic journals, magazines, newspapers. M for monograph. Those are distinct publications. So any of our plays are a title level equals M. Books, title level equals M. Series is an S value. And then unpublished works like dissertations and theses, those are going to be a U value. Now, when you type a level attribute, you're going to get a drop down with these values. And if you scroll through it with your little mouse or with your little keyboard arrows, as you highlight over A, you'll get a description that says articles, poems, works published as part of a larger item. And so don't worry about memorizing all of it perfectly. We try to set it up to help you. So some examples, Henry V, that gets wrapped in a level M title. That will render in italics on our website, so it's a play title. Ode to the Onion, that's a poem, so it gets wrapped in title level equals A. Our series, such as the New Penguin Shakespeare, that's a title level equals S. And then here's a PhD dissertation, mediating for immediacy, that's title level equals U. The next thing that you'll want to tag is non-English languages. And we use the foreign element for that. So the first thing that you will do is, if you've got something in Latin or Greek or French or whatever other language, wrap it in the foreign tag. And it's going to give you an error message. And that error message will be that you need XML lang attribute on foreign. So then you can add that. Now we have quite a list of languages that you can choose from. We also have English in there and maybe one other, I can't remember. But assuming that the majority of your critical paratext is in English, you won't be marking a foreign language as English. So you'll select the correct one. Each of them has a value, ang for Old English, and so on. And just select the one that is correct in your case. If you have a language that you need to tag that is not in this list, please email me because we can add that. So then you add the value. So this is Latin. We know from this list that Latin is LA. And so there's our value as LA. This will also render in italic on the website. The next big thing to encode is quotation marks. In your text, you're not going to, or in your critical paratext in Oxygen, you're not going to type quotation marks. It's just not how we do things because we want to say, why are these quotation marks here? And when I got started with LEMDO, Janelle said, Navarra, one day you're going to want to be writing in CEI all the time. And I did not think that was true, but quotation marks, those are the things I always want to be doing in CEI because I love how specific it is and how descriptive you can be of what you are writing. Quotation marks is where I really find that. So we have a lot of elements that render in quotation marks or turn into quotation marks. And you will need to decide which one is correct in each situation. So when you have a direct quote, you're going to use the quote element. When you have a term, often you're getting ready to give a definition or a gloss for it, you'll wrap it in the element term. If you have a gloss, that gloss, you want it to be in quotation marks. It's not a direct quote from something, wrap it in gloss. I will note here, if you're directly quoting like the OED or something like that, you're still going to use the quote element. But if it's not direct quote, you still want those quotation marks, gloss is the way to go. Our disclaimers, our scare quotes, those are going to be wrapped in so-called. So-called is also used for things like proverbs and expressions that can't be attributed to any particular person. They just are out there in the world. We want them to be in quotation marks. They're going to be wrapped in so-called. You're going to use mentioned when you're discussing a word as a word. So I couldn't write the word truthfully, and I want truthfully to be in quotation marks. That's going to be mentioned because I'm discussing it as that word. And then we have Q. Q is our kind of ambiguous element. It's for quotes inside of a quote. We also wrap, let's say you're discussing the use of the letter S, you'd wrap that S in the Q element. If you're quoting with variation, you'll also use the Q element. And those are, your 6 elements that will turn into quotation marks. 2 quick notes about quotes. When you've got a gap, use the gap element. So a gap in a quote, use the gap element with a reason equals sampling rather than using an ellipsis. It will turn into an ellipsis, but it will make it clear that you're the person who decided to get rid of some material rather than you're quoting something that includes an ellipsis in that. Same thing when you're supplying content in a quote, use the supplied element rather than square brackets. Because that says you're the person who supplied this, not whoever you're quoting happened to have square brackets. If you've got block quotes, we deal with those slightly differently than with regular quotes. And they typically use 3 elements, but will have at least 2. So the first one that you need to have is sit. This is what's going to mark it out as a block quote. You'll then put a child quote element, and that's where your text will go. If you just have prose, it just goes straight in there. No need for P elements inside unless you're quoting multiple paragraphs, at which point you can wrap them in their own P elements. Once you have your quote, you'll then add your citation inside of a bibble element. So you've got your sit, and inside of your sit, you have both quote and bibble. In bibble, you're going to put parentheses, and inside your citation, this is the Hollandshire Chronicles, the 1587 ones, page 545. And we have, as usual, when we're citing something from our shared bibliography, a ref link with type equals bibble that links back to that XML ID in bibble 1. Special case, you're quoting a speech. You can just put your speech elements in there. So you've got your quote, and then you have a child's speech, SP. And then you have, as a child of SP, your speaker element wrapped. So you've got your speaker wrapped in the speaker element. And then if you're doing a verse speech, wrap each of those lines in L, just like you would in your modernized text. If you've got a verse or a prose speech, wrap it all in P, just as you would in your modernized text. And that will render it quite nicely. It'll still be a block quote, but now you'll have your speaker marked out using our typical rendering for speakers. And still we have that bibble element for our citation. Now I see a question in the chat. As an example, just for me to really get quotes, gloss versus term versus cue. If a character says a word and then another character repeats it, which is the correct tag? Janelle, do you want to jump in?
Yep. I've been thinking about that with an edition I'm working on as well. So if a character repeats a word that another character has said at some point previously, then use the quote element. Sometimes you have characters sort of imagining what somebody might have said or suggesting what they could say or misquoting somebody. In that case, I use the cue element. Okay, and now I made a note in my encoding note for my edition that that's how I've handled things. But I've actually decided to move that into the LEMDO documentation because it seems like something that we should be doing across the board. If you are not sure how to handle something that seems like somebody parroting somebody else, then you can talk to your coordinating editor or you can talk to me.
Thank you, Janelle. Okay. The next thing that you might want to tag is any emphasis. So marking out stress in your text. And how you will do that is by adding an emph tag. So one word in this sentence is very important. I've wrapped that in emph. Note, please do not use all caps to indicate emphasis. All caps aren't super accessible, and we have default formatting to show emphasis. So use that emph tag rather than using all caps.
Navarra, may I ask a question?
Yes.
Um, did we decide to go through with italicizing when it's in a primary text?
I don't know. I sent you an email a while ago.
Right, I'll
Um,
follow up. Thank
yep,
you.
that sounds good. Currently, we render emph with bold, but using italics instead is in discussion right now. Okay, so a quick recap of all of that pile of information that we've just gone over. We started off today talking about sections in your text, using the div element to create section divisions, and remembering that each div should have an XMLED attribute and should also have a child head element. Now, one thing that I forgot to mention, you can nest your divs. So you can have, your heading level 1, then your heading level 2, or, your section within a section, your subsections. Avoid doing it more than necessary and avoid nesting more than 3 levels of divisions because it just gets kind of muddy after that. But, having a subsection is totally doable. You can nest your divs. For lists, you're going to use your list element. Each list should have a rend attribute, which will determine whether it renders as bulleted, numbered, or just a plain list. When your list is part of a paragraph, you're always going to have it as the child of that P. If it's not part of a paragraph, it can be outside of the P element. And you may give your list a head element before the first item. For tables, you're going to use the table element. Each one must have at least one row. The first row is typically going to have a role equals label on it, and then subsequent rows will have role equals data. Your columns are established by the number of cells that you have in each row. And you'll get a schematron error if you're inconsistent with that number. So if you have 3 cells in that first row, you need to have 3 cells throughout. And you may give your table a head as well, using that head element before the first row.
That should be cell element.
Pardon me?
That's a cell element.
Where?
Third last bullet point.
Yes, that should say element. That's an element, not attribute. For images, if you have 3 images or less, you're going to be doing the same thing that is currently in our documentation and that you will have been doing since, if you've been working in LEMDO for a while, since you started working with LEMDO. Those 3 images or less than 3 images, they're stored in the SVN repo. If you have 4 or more, they're going to be stored on our images server, and you'll just email me a link to a drive with those images. And your basic encoding is going to be a figure element with a child graphic, which has a child desk. And then also as a child of figure, you'll have a fig desk with your image caption. Other things that you'll encode are titles, non-English languages, any of your quotation marks, gap type equals sampling to show gaps in your quotes, supplied, to show supplied text in your quotes, block quotes, emphasis, and then you'll also be encoding your links, which we've done in previous webinars. Resources, because we covered a lot today, we have a lot of them. And some of them are in different places. So we've got all of our critical paratext ones. I think those are chapter 17, if I recall correctly. And then for images, you're going to go to the media chapter. Quotations, everything in chapter 11, that's going to give you what you need to know. We've got more stuff on encoding citations, specifically citing Shakespeare, citing the OED. And then we have 2 webinars that have been published on our YouTube already that will give you some good information if you need a refresher. That diversity, access, and accessibility one will give you a good refresher on alt text and also using plain language when you're writing. And our technical collation information webinar gives you information on how to link using ref and pointer elements. And that's relevant in your critical paratexts. It's not just a collation thing for sure. Before we wrap up, I would like to say thank you to the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada for funding this webinar series. I did the slide design. Thank you to Martin Holmes and Janelle for the TEI customization, and also to UVic's Humanities Computing and Media Center for site design and hosting. Stop sharing my screen for just a moment, and I will pull up, Janelle's given us a handy link to something that has an image in a LEMDO text that has actually already been published. Okay, so you should be seeing my screen now. I will zoom it in a bit. Here we have an image in a critical paratext, and it has been sized to fit kind of in line with this column. The image itself, I believe, is wider in its original form, but it is formatted so that it fits in nicely. And here, this is what happens with our fig desk. I believe this one, if I right click, I hit inspect on that image. It's kind of hard to see here, but we have the alt text, a painting of 2 bearded white men, one on the left, and then it cuts off in this quick description of it. But that's the alt text is there. It's not visible just when you're looking, but you can find it. Okay, are there any other questions? Okay, in that case, I will stop recording and I will say thank you all for coming this morning.